Today's episode of Beyond the Mask is presented by the team at CRNA Financial Planning. Get a free consultation today to be guided through the complexities of investing and financial planning. Just visit crnafinancialplanning.com. And don't forget, listening to our podcast can earn you Class B credits. For more information on how you can submit them, check out the CE Credit tab on our website, beyondthemaskpodcast.com. Welcome to Beyond the Mask, innovation and opportunities for CRNAs and advanced practice nurses, with certified financial planner Jeremy Stanley and CRNA Sharon Pierce. Jeremy Stanley has worked with CRNAs for more than 23 years, and Sharon Pierce is a former president of the AANA and the NCANA. Join us as we leave the operating room and learn the latest in the CRNA and advanced practice nurse industries. Beyond the Mask starts in 10, 9, 8, 7.
Hey Sharon, how are you?
I'm doing good. How you feeling sitting on that side of the table,
Well,
Jeremy?
you know, it's kind of weird me not driving today and not being in control. You know, it's about the only time when I'm with you that I get to feel a little bit of control is control the board and control the recording. So if anything screwed up today, guys, it wasn't me, it was Sharon. So.
Yeah, well, I've got to learn sometime since I'm going to be doing some taping coming up without you.
Yeah. I mean, we've gotten too busy and sometimes we can't be in the same place. So we're going to have some special guests sitting in for us soon. And
we chose them very wisely. They will be people that can either guest co-host with me or guest co-host with you.
Yeah, exactly.
What would they be? Amphibious?
Depends on which school you went to.
Uh-oh. All right, time to get started.
So we have our favorite guests back in house with us today.
And in our favorite place, we're in the studio together.
We're in the studio today, yeah. We love being in the studio. And who do we have with us?
Well, that's easy enough. Our historical geniuses.
That's right. Nancy and Sandy, welcome back.
Well, thank you. It's very good to be here, back in the studio on this beautiful spring day.
I know, right? It's supposed to be 86 degrees out here today.
Yeah.
I know. And today is the twins' birthday. The day that we're taping, it's April 21st.
Yeah.
And the twins are 36 years old today.
I don't think they want you announcing that on air to everybody.
People can do the math. Actually, they probably don't care, but now people can kind of figure out.
Well, it's my sister's birthday today. It's her big 65th birthday.
All right.
And I think Deb Geisler has a birthday today.
Oh, my goodness.
April 21st is a special day for a lot of our
It is.
friends.
Lots of good people, but it's snowing where the girls are.
Is it really?
Last year it snowed 12 inches up there on their birthday, but this morning I saw where it was snowing in Hudson.
Wow. Yeah, no thank you.
Yeah,
I'm ready for the spring to spring and the summer to be here. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, Sandy, why don't you tell us about our topic today before we get started?
Okay, well, most nurse anesthetists know about Dagmar Nelson in terms of the trial, and probably just superficial points about the trial. She was a defendant in the only court trial ever to test the legality of nurses administering anesthesia, and that was in 1934. But there's more to her than just that. She was an amazing woman when you really get down after the trial. The trial is quite important, and why the defense argued in the way they did, which has really been our cross to bear since that time, and we'll get into that. And then, what is her legacy? And it's really quite big.
Well, some of our younger listeners and our students might not even know about the trial, so we're going to go in depth about all of that, right? So listeners, listen up. This is something you're going to want to hear about.
Yeah, so Nancy, why don't you tell us a little bit about her early life, and we'll kind of move forward from there.
Well, her full name was Dagmar Alexandra Nelson, and she was born on April 15th, 1892, which for that year was Good Friday. Her parents were both born in Denmark, and then immigrated to the United States and settled in St. Paul, Minneapolis. She was the fifth of 8 children and the oldest girl. Her older brother left Minnesota and went to Montana to farm. The business failed, and he returned to Minnesota, and Nelson was the only child to leave St. Paul and never return. So of the 8 children, one brother left and came back. She left and never came back. The rest of them stayed right where they had been born and grown up.
Well, maybe they like the weather just a little bit better.
Maybe so. But looking at her, and as we look at her life, it's not surprising she never looked back.
Yeah.
And just kept on moving.
Well, it's amazing about that in this time period as well. You know, I think given the fact that, you know, women just didn't do that in those days.
That's right.
That obviously tells you a lot about her personality and her pioneering spirit. So,
as we'll see moving through this, she was always a woman in control.
Ooh.
All the way to her death.
Our
that doesn't sound
ancestry.
All the
familiar
way
at all.
to her death. She controlled everything.
I like her already.
Well, you would have liked her because she was a major dresser.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Well, Sandy, tell us about her education.
Okay, Dagmar Nelson received her nursing education in Rochester, Minnesota at St. Mary's Hospital, which would later become Mayo Clinic. So again, another big star that Mayo Clinic gives to us way back then. She finished her 2-year nurses training in 1912, and after that became a private duty nurse for a patient that was from Seattle. So when he returned home, she decided she would go home with him to Seattle as his private duty nurse. And without history recording it, that's probably her first view of the West Coast, which I think she really liked a lot. And but she stayed a year there with him, and then she went back to what was now the Mayo Clinic to become what they call one of the Mayo Clinic nurses. In 1923, she ventured out of Minnesota to New York, where she took a job as a medical surgical nurse. And after a stay in New York, I don't think it was very long, she returned to Mayo to begin her 6-month training in nurse anesthesia, because that was about how long it was back then, under the supervision of Mary Hines. Now, I've really tried to find more information on Mary Hines, and I've not been able to, but she was like the chief of nurse anesthesia at Mayo Clinic at the time, followed by, I think, Florence Henderson. And so she was a very remarkable person. And while she was in nurses training at Mayo, her earliest role in this specialty was likely sparked by her interest of what Alice McGall was doing. And we remember that Alice McGall is known as our mother of anesthesia. She's the mother of nurse anesthesia. And Florence Henderson. I mean, think of all of us when we were in, like, diploma programs and so forth, and we rotated through the operating room. We were all ears and all eyes, and we watched a lot. But even in my time, I really was focused on that nurse anesthetist and what that nurse anesthetist did. And for her, that nurse anesthetist was Alice McGall. Mayo was small then, and everybody knew everybody. Now, I don't know if that's good or bad, really,
Right,
in today's time.
Yeah.
But, again, they seemed to think it was good. And so she probably had conversations with Edith Graham, who became Edith Graham Mayo. And Edith learned anesthesia techniques from William Mayo. And so she probably knew all of those heroes of the time. Now, what was her training like? From what I can find in the historical literature, she observed another anesthetist for several weeks before she was allowed to administer anesthesia herself. So it was more like on-the-job training. See one, do one, teach one. In that day, she used ether and chloroform, although not a lot of chloroform, but she did use it, nitrous oxide, ethyl chloride, with oxygen. At the time, it was very common to administer a small percentage of carbon dioxide
Wow.
with the inspired gases to stimulate respiration. And ether was given either by open drop or by mask with oxygen and nitrous oxide.
Boy, I'm glad they didn't have pulse ox because, some of them had to be.
That's right. Well, they talked about, I think, one of the big victories of Agatha Hodgins is she could use nitrous oxide and maintain a pink circulation.
Wow.
So you just have to ask yourself what percentage of nitrous oxide was the rest of these people given.
I know.
Crowell would only let Agatha Hodgins use that. He would not let any of the interns or residents or anybody use it. He said because in the hands of the expert, it was the best, but in the hands of a non-expert, it was very, very dangerous.
No kidding.
Wow.
And as I said, she didn't use much chloroform, and she was not taught a regional anesthesia. So these were the gases in what they used. So how about the monitoring? Well, we could probably sum that up saying it was pretty much non-existent as we know it today. She kept a finger on the pulse. Routine monitors were the ears, the eyes, and the hands of the anesthetist. Mostly physicians took blood pressure in the day, and they only did that for diagnostic situations. Like it looked like the patient was dying, we better see what the blood pressure is, I guess. The anesthetist observed very, very closely the depth, the rate, the quality of respiration. And you remember that Agatha Hodgins used to walk the floors at night just listening to people breathe, so she would know what normal respirations would be when someone was asleep. And in addition to that, they kept a finger on the pulse, monitoring the rate, the rhythm, and the strength. IV fluids were not routinely given, and things like an EKG, for example, was 40 years in the future. I mean, look at this time. I mean, I trained in anesthesia in 1967 to 1969, and we didn't have an EKG on everybody. Mm-hmm. We had maybe 2 or 3 what we used to call bullet monitors, and the sickest patient would get one, and as little student nurses, we'd go set up our room and then go to breakfast, and if you weren't careful, somebody would come steal your bullet monitor out of your room while you were at breakfast, so you wouldn't even go to breakfast. Once you got it, it was yours, and that was it. But the monitoring, as we know it today, was not there, so they really, they had to be attentive, and they had to just use their senses to adequately take care of these patients. And, I can remember the time, even in 1967, 69, we couldn't take a blood pressure in an infant. And we used precordial stethoscopes. And you can tell a lot in terms of the strength of the heart tone, a finger on the pulse, the strength of that, and in terms of where that patient is when they're getting in a pretty good state or not so good. If that's all you have, you really can gain a lot from it. But that was her early education, and but she had the best of the teachers, for sure.
It sounds like she had a good crew, yeah.
Yeah, amen. I was doing an EGD at the hospital the other day, and it was time to be relieved, and the other CRNA walked in, and whenever I do them, I'm up there holding their airway. Most people don't do that, but I'm up there at the top, and then I will lean over so I can hear if there's any air moving, and CRNA relieving me come in. She goes, "Are you kissing the patient? What are you doing?" And her mother was a CRNA. I said, "Why don't you ask your mother what I'm doing?"
Well, Nancy, why don't you tell us a little bit about her early life as a nurse anesthetist?
Okay. I always wondered how they gave oxygen.
Just blow by.
I mean, where did they have oxygen tanks? Where did they get it? That's...
Yeah, if you look at some of the old pictures, you see the big cylinders. So there had to be oxygen tanks and tanks of nitrous oxide.
Well, heck, I still use the big H cylinders in the plastic surgery office because we didn't have piped in oxygen. We just hooked it up to the back of the gas machine.
Yeah.
Still.
Well, looking at her as she moved forward in her career, while she was at Mayo, Dagmar met a physician called Dr. Vern Hunt, and the literature says he was a very good-looking man. I think
we need to find a
I think-
picture.
I think in our terms we would have called him a hunk.
He was good looking, I can tell you.
Oh, we'll find that picture.
We
need to
are.
put
We're
that
going to
in the
show that
notes.
picture at the Seattle meeting.
Well, send
or
it
no,
to
at the
us.
Charleston meeting, because Nancy and
Yeah.
I are speaking at the North Carolina meeting on Dagmar Nelson in September. So come to that, and you will see that handsome Verna
Handsome
Hunt.
plus.
Yes. Surgeon.
But he was very influential in her life a few years later. But after years at Mayo, Dr. Hunt returned to Los Angeles, California, where he spent a year as an intern. He joined the staff at several hospitals in the LA area, but he spent most of his time at St. Vincent's Hospital. And this was during the Depression, and times were rough. So very few physicians practiced anesthesia full time because it didn't pay very much. And those that did were usually always surgeons. And if they were surgeons and giving anesthesia to make enough money to get by in the Depression, they were also general practitioner physicians. And they relied on all of this for most of their income because it was really hard times for physicians as well as everyone else at that time. So at this time, most nurse anesthetists in Los Angeles County were employed by hospitals, and some hospitals used nurse anesthetists exclusively.
We're looking at the picture.
I Googled the picture.
You can
of
see
Verna
by the
Hunt,
way
you know.
he's posed
Yes, that was
that
my
he
thought.
thinks
He was
a lot of himself.
Yes, he does.
Okay.
He thinks a lot of himself. You're right. Yes.
But getting back to this, his physician anesthetist were available. Nurse anesthetists were assigned to patients who could not pay.
Well,
Imagine that.
nothing has changed.
I was like, yeah, what's changed with that? Right?
Yeah.
So one nurse anesthetist at the time was Sophie Winton, and she actually billed her patients, and she did not accept hospital employment. So maybe she's the first independent business person
She
in
very well could have
anesthesia.
been.
I mean,
Oh.
I give y'all an assignment. Y'all have got to start looking her up.
No. Who's going to do that? Is Stacy Yancey
Yeah, she's
from
gonna
North
do it.
Carolina and Megan
So
Connor. They're going to be presenting in the at our state meeting in September. September, yeah, about Sophie Winton. She was highly decorated in World War I, and I feel sure she was the first to do independent billing.
Well,
Wow.
stay tuned, folks. I'll talk to Stacy, and we'll get that podcast
Right.
taped.
Well, Dr. Vern Hunt did not have an easy time at St. Vincent's Hospital
Why?
because he had a terrible temper. And if a nurse handed him the wrong instrument or wrong thing, he would throw it.
Well, again, times did not change.
But throw it out of the
But I
seventh
know,
floor
seventh
window.
floor window.
They didn't have the windows closed.
That's right.
Oh.
in the operating
It was
room.
hot. They didn't have any air conditioning. This is L.A.
Oh my God.
So okay.
Wonder
If-
what their infection rate was.
don't-
Probably
well-
was just fine.
I don't know, but you know what that reminds me of is I was in San Francisco for a meeting one time. Got sick as a dog. We had gone out to eat the night before, and I ate the Caesar salad dressing, not knowing that Caesar salad
Has
dressing is
anchovies.
raw eggs in it.
Yeah.
So I got salmonella, not knowing at the time, and I'd gone to my meeting and come back on the bus, and this guy looks at me who I didn't know, and he goes, "Are you okay?" I was white. I went in the bathroom, and I was deathly sick. So here I am in San Francisco, downtown, and I'm Googling. I can't remember if I could Google at the time, but anyway, I got to a doctor, and I walk in this doctor's office, which was on like the 14th floor of this building downtown. Glass door. I remember opening it up, and it was the frosted glass. I open it up, and I look in, and there's a window right across. It's open, and there are pigeons flying in and out, walking around the waiting room. And I never forgot that. I thought this doctor's office in San Francisco had the windows open and birds flying in and out. And here I
Only in
am.
San Francisco.
Oh yeah, I was like, wow. But that's what that reminded me of. Yeah.
Did he have a bird feeder in there?
No, he didn't have. No, it was crazy. I mean,
They had bird poop on the carpet or
yeah,
whatever.
And I can't remember what he told me, but it was something really, really bad was wrong with me, or I'd gotten salmonella, and I was like, I'm going to choose to think it's salmonella. So literally for 6 days, all I did was sit in the room and run back and forth to the bathroom. And
you were really thin.
The
and
hotel,
svelte when you come back.
Oh, I lost 17 pounds during that time.
Oh my gosh.
There's no lie. And I remember the hotel folks were so nice. They would bring crackers and ginger ales up to me repeatedly. The last day I was there, so I'd planned all these trips in San Francisco. I was going to go to Muir Woods and, go down to wherever Clint Eastwood, what's the name of that little place he was from. And the last day I was there, I got to eat. I ate some mashed potatoes, and I flew home. And that was my whole trip
That
to
was
San
your
Francisco.
whole trip.
Yeah.
And so when that picture of you and George Bush where you're so skinny, is that right whenever you got home? Because you were so
That was
thin.
pretty close.
Yeah,
That
you
was
are
pretty
so
close.
stinking
Yeah.
thin in
Yeah.
that picture.
Yeah, that was pretty close timing. Yep. Yep. Good
Hey,
idea.
I'm pretty
Yeah.
good. All right, so sorry. We digress.
Well, anyway, like I said, and Sandy said, he would get so angry that he would throw the instruments out the window when he was on the 7th floor. And so it was a routine job for the orderlies to go outside and retrieve the instruments from the lawn at the end of his surgeries.
I'm surprised the nurse anesthetist
That was
didn't
every
have to do
day that he operated.
He didn't have any. That's the only reason.
They had to go down and pick up the instruments and bring them back so that they had instruments to operate with.
Oh, my goodness.
So needless to say, he was demanding of his anesthetist. And if he didn't like how they administered anesthesia, he wouldn't let him administer anesthesia anymore for him. So on one occasion, Hunt was operating at another hospital in Los Angeles where Dr. William Chalmers Francis was administering the anesthesia. And he was also, Dr. William Chalmers Francis was also the head of the group. So Hunt didn't like the anesthesia results, and he never asked Dr. Chalmers Francis to administer any anesthesia again for him, ever.
And he probably never forgot him because he went after him really hard because it was the Chalmers Francis Dagmar Nelson case. This was the physician that was bringing the charges against Dagmar Nelson for practicing medicine without a license. So Hunt already had a bad eye out on him.
Oh, my goodness. So, Sandy, I'm sure Miss Nelson was on the move. As always, it sounds like she is. So what took her from Mayo to California besides the hunk?
Yeah, well, it was pretty much the hunk. At the time that Dr. Hunt arrived at St. Vincent's, there were no nurse anesthetists, Jeremy. That's why the nurse anesthetists weren't picking up the instruments at the end of every operating day.
Gotcha.
So anesthesia was administered by surgeons or house officers or interns. Or at one time, a physician anesthetist administered an overdose of an anesthetic to Dr. Hunt's patient, and the patient died in the operating room. And Dr. Hunt had never lost a patient in the operating room before. And so that obviously left an impression on him. So he sent a letter to Mayo, to Dagmar Nelson, because he had known her when he was there earlier, and asked her to come to California and be his anesthetist. He told her she would be his exclusive anesthetist, but she would be employed by the hospital. She would work for the hospital when she was not giving anesthesia for him, and would be available to other surgeons to administer their anesthesia if they wanted her when he was not performing surgery.
Well, that sounds like something I couldn't review.
That's right. So Hunt let her know that California was a hotbed against nurse anesthetists. And at that time, physicians anesthetists were getting organized in some states, and California was one of those states. And they were doing this under the direction of the Meachams, who never were. He was a physician, but he was wheelchair bound due to arthritis, so he never practiced medicine. But his reason for being was to eliminate non-physician anesthetists from the face of the earth in the United States. So he was organizing these people at that time. So probably not to Hunt's surprise, she accepted his invitation, and moved to California. She had already been to Seattle. She probably liked, the West Coast. And she administered her first anesthetic for Hunt on September 5th, 1932. So, as I said, there was unrest for nurse anesthetists in California at the time. In the previous 3 years, physician anesthetists had been trying to rid the county, that was particularly around Los Angeles and so forth, of nurse anesthetists. They attempted twice to have the Attorney General of California render an opinion that the administration of anesthesia was a practice of medicine. But they lost both challenges. But never say never. The physicians circulated a letter to hospitals in Los Angeles stating they had won. And some different nurse anesthetists began to lose their job just because of this propaganda. Now, at the time, Adeline Curtis was a nurse anesthetist who was targeted, and she was very aggressive. If you look how she was described at the formation of the ANA, she was very supportive of that. She was the aggressor. Hilda Solomon was benevolent, and Agatha Hodgins was said to be visionary. That's how they, described.
Everybody took their roles.
Everybody had how they described those through roles. So in 1928, physician anesthetists got a statement from the California Board of Medical Examiners that said anesthesia was a practice of medicine. And, they've really not moved off of that, even to this day. No. They still believe that anesthesia is the sole.
Well, that happened, North Carolina, 1998,
right.
I believe it was.
Practice of
Cindy
medicine.
Black was president.
Yeah. Some nurse anesthetists lost their jobs, but in other cases, hospitals like St. Vincent's, where Dr. Hunt was, he just ignored it. He said, what is this? We're not paying any attention to this. So Miss Curtis obtained an attorney. His name was Thomas McFadden, who asked for an opinion from the California Attorney General, who stated there was no law prohibiting a nurse from administering anesthesia. In 1931, a letter from the California Attorney General went on to state the practice of dentistry and medicine involves the prescribing of treatment, but the mere mechanical administration without prescribing does not constitute the practice of either dentistry or medicine. Very, very important statements there. And so in Los Angeles, nurse anesthetists heard of the Curtis case, in the Attorney General's opinion, and were determined to join forces and organize into an association. They knew that one person couldn't do it. Now, this was before NANA was formed, because we didn't form until 1931, and this was in 1928-29. So in 1929, the group formed the California Nurse Anesthetists Association. And by 1931, the International Association of Nurse Anesthetists, soon to be changed to the National Association of Nurse Anesthetists, was formed. But in California, they already had 149 active members way back in the 1920s of nurses that were administering anesthesia. So what was bringing the physicians forward again? It probably was the economic pinch of the Depression that led these physician anesthetists to renew their attack against nurse anesthetists in October of 1933. And the victim was Dagmar Nelson. They already had been after Adeline Curtis, but she got the Attorney General's opinion, and now it was Dagmar Nelson. And the physician anesthetist was led by that poor anesthetist, we know that from Dr. Hunt. He didn't like him, wouldn't let him do his cases, Dr. Chalmers Francis. And he filed an injunction to restrain Nelson and St. Vincent's Hospital from, quote, practicing medicine without a license. And it was Dr. Hunt, Adeline Curtis, and Sophie Winton. Now, she had some money because she was direct billing way back then. Yeah. And so she helped pay for the Dagmar Nelson defense. The defense tried to get the case dropped by claiming the parties bringing suit did not have standing. We hear that a lot, today. Opinions from the Supreme Court don't have standing to bring action. But the judge ruled that the anesthesia section of the Los Angeles Medical Society could not bring suit. They didn't have standing. That was correct. But he went on to say that individual physicians, Chalmers Francis, could bring suit. After the hearing and the ruling by the judge, someone from the LA Medical Society inserted an item in press stating the judge had ruled again in their favor. And anesthesia was a practice of medicine. They didn't say that at all. He just said that the society couldn't bring suit, but individual physicians could. And so Nelson's attorney wrote a strong letter of complaint, and a retraction was published the next month.
Which nobody read.
But the
Probably.
damage was already done.
It was done,
as
yeah.
normal. Yeah.
It's like,
It's
you
the
know,
same playbook.
It is. It's
It
like
is.
over
Oh,
and
yeah.
over and
Oh,
over
yeah.
and over again. Yeah, it's amazing. How do you break the cycle, Sharon? Figure it out.
Yeah.
So there you have how she got there.
Beyond the Mask is made possible by the team at CRNA Financial Planning. With almost 2 decades of experience, the firm guides CRNAs through the complexities of investing and financial planning. Schedule a free consultation today by calling 855-304-3748 or go online to crnafinancialplanning.com.
Nancy, the trial begins, and I'm sure there are a few fireworks. Let's talk about that a little bit.
Okay. Well, round number 1, the trial started July 12th, 1934. Dagmar Nelson's attorney argued that since the issue was the illegal practice of medicine, this case should not be settled in the court, but should be brought by the Attorney General as a criminal violation of law. The defense already knew the Attorney General was on their side, and this was based upon a letter that was received by Adeline Curtis, and by the fact that no nurse anesthetist had been charged for that violation to date. So, in other words, practicing medicine. The plaintiffs argued that while the violation of the Medical Practice Act was one issue, the license to practice medicine was an exclusive property right and should remain in the court. The license, they argued, was a property right granted by the state to authorized persons who hold it the right to practice medicine. So anyone practicing medicine without it was trespassing on the license and damaging incomes, money,
There you go.
of all
Ding, ding,
those
ding.
who held the license legally. The judge generally agreed with defense, but wanted to hear all arguments from both sides and ordered the case to continue. There is a saying among some attorneys, if you have the law on your side, pound the law. If you have truth on your side, pound the truth. And if you have neither on your side, pound the table and appeal to the emotions of the jury. Don't forget that one.
I won't.
So there was no jury in this case. So arguments on both sides occurred. The plaintiffs pounded the law of California medical examiners, drawing from surgeon witnesses what their responsibility was with regard to the anesthetized patient and what they could see and do during the case. So, in other words, they brought surgeons in, and had them testify to, what they could do in addition to doing their surgery. The defense pounded the truth, arguing that the nurse, acting under the supervision and direction of the operating surgeon who was present, was in full control of the anesthetic. Now, keep in mind this acting under the supervision of the surgeon. The surgeon was able to monitor the condition of the patient by being informed of the observations of the nurse. The defense also argued that the anesthesia was not only a part of nursing, but was taught in some schools of nursing, and that was true. There were some schools of nursing that were teaching anesthesia. Nurses who had no anesthesia training administered ether to obstetric patients to slow labor until the obstetrician could come, and they were doing this with no obstetrician, no physician of any kind there when they were using this ether to slow labor. Plaintiff surgeons argued they could not see patients during the case, and defense surgeons argued they could see the patient's face, feel a pulse, and watch respirations from the surgical field.
And look at what color the blood was.
And tell the nurse anesthetist.
Whenever I first started in anesthesia school, a lot of the CRNA still would say incision made, blood red.
Yes,
you know.
that's true. We didn't have pulse oximetry.
Yeah, they still
we had
did
to
it.
document something, did we?
They still did it. Yeah.
That's true. The plaintiff argued only physicians could order the administration of drugs as well as dose. In anesthesia, no doses were ever ordered, so the nurse was practicing illegally when she was administering anesthesia. Defense responded it was common for physicians to order drugs, especially for pain, on an as-needed basis, with the nurse making the decision as to when and how much to give. Now, I don't remember making that decision. They usually had a dose there during my time.
No, we still had a range and how often you could give it whenever I was an ICU nurse. I mean, it would be 2 to 10 milligrams of morphine PRN for pain.
Okay, but
So,
there was some
There
dose
was
there.
some,
Yeah.
there was some dose, but you had latitude on how much you would give.
So in regard to an inhalation agent, the defense argued they ordered the drug to be administered and were there if the nurse did it wrong. When asked about dosages, they argued that they ordered the patient to be put to sleep and keep the patient safe and anesthetized. So no order for dosages for such an order. So there was really no reason to have any kind of dosage to
Well,
give.
think about ether.
I mean,
Would
how
they
do you-
would drop 2 drops
I know.
or whatever?
I mean, I was just
it
sitting
was
here.
just such a nebulous thing, giving anesthesia. That whole thing.
You mean even I could have done it, Sharon? That's what you're
well,
saying.
There you go.
So, but you're right. I mean, they were mostly dropping ether, and how do you decide what dose? How do you even know how much you gave when the case is over? But anyway, some surgeons said they demanded the patient be safely anesthetized, and that order was sufficient. Many who testified said they were in full charge of everything in the room, including administration of anesthesia. And they acknowledged that no more than 2 weeks training in anesthesia, or none at all, was what was happening with the nurse anesthetist.
Wow. Sounds like the same thing now. You have less training. You can't give anesthesia without a supervision of a physician because you're not trained.
But then, how can the surgeon be in charge of everything in the room? Think about it.
Well, that gets to what we're going to talk about at the end, the captain of the ship doctrine and what happened to it.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Well, there's still a whole gender issue wrapped up in all of this that is tinging this. And, the patriarchal model is alive and well in medicine, and it's slowly being chipped away. But, you think about it back then, I'd love to know the numbers, how many CRNAs were actually female. And I would say the majority of them were female. But I don't know that for a fact.
Well, I think that's interesting. It brings up a good point for me because, I've been around 24 years now in nurse anesthesia. And Sandy and Nancy, I'll just go back to you. I mean, I don't remember as many males being in as there are now. Do you know what the ratios were back then?
No, it was mostly female profession then. The women were nurses and to become nurse anesthetists, and the men often were doctors.
Yeah.
And that, if you look at how Bankert wrote her book, and certainly how Virginia Thatcher wrote her book, it was always her, with the anesthetist, and him with the surgeon. And Bankert really stressed that a lot in her book. But it changed after, particularly, I think, World War II, and then on after Vietnam, because they had all the funding, and so the guys from the service could come back and get GI Bills.
You have another theory, Nancy?
I remember the first male that was admitted at the nursing school at Baptist Hospital.
Martin Comer, was it?
It may have been. I can't
I'm
remember.
pretty sure.
You said nursing.
Nursing. I'm talking
Nursing,
about
okay.
the first male student
Okay.
to come to the hospital at Baptist Hospital came my senior year in nursing school.
And where
that
was
was in
it?
the 60s.
Okay, well,
So-
that's Vietnam
Yeah.
or Korean
That's
War.
right.
Yeah.
Well, 50s was Korea, and the 60s was Vietnam.
Well, I see another podcast in the making.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, it's interesting.
Yeah, I think, but then the men started. And today we know it's generally 50-50.
That's right, 50-50.
Yeah.
How many males were in your class? I know Jerry was in there.
6.
And Paul.
We had more men than women.
6 out of how many?
10. We
10.
had 6
Really?
men and 4 women.
And you were in school, what, in the 80s?
Shut up.
There were no men.
Well,
in
if you
my
go
class.
back to our school where the 3 of us
Yeah.
graduated and look at the wall of pictures
Yes.
on the wall, we have a picture of every graduated class since 1942.
Yeah.
Leroy Hawks, the late Leroy Hawks, was in my class in 1967, and he was one of the few men on that picture prior to then. A cook guy was the first male to graduate from our school, and there was a handful. That's it.
Well,
Yeah.
I think that'd be an interesting subject and talk about gender related to nurse anesthesia. Of course, I'm always grateful that we have so many men because that's why we make money. It would have stayed feminized, kind of like teaching. Now teaching is getting more men, so it's not as economically depressed anymore. So that'd be a good podcast. Y'all get on that.
Yeah.
How do you like getting
We got
orders
to
from
record
me
some
now?
of these. We got stacked up for doing it more.
Well, getting
Nancy,
back,
who was Arthur Goodell? He testified
all
for
right.
the physicians.
yeah, I was getting
Is
to
that
him.
Goodell Airway?
Yeah,
Yeah, it is. But also signs
signs and
stages of anesthesia.
anesthesia. So Dr. Arthur Goodell testified for the physicians, and as we mentioned, his name is very familiar to anesthesia because he did develop some equipment, and like I said, he did the ether signs and stages, and actually there were signs and stages for chloroform and nitrous oxide also, but his ether signs and stages were probably the most recognized. But he gave a detailed exploration of his theory that eye signs were key to knowing the stage and plane of anesthesia. And he was right. He argued there was no way an operating surgeon could make these observations and control the anesthetic. So, true, you know. He stated he was writing a book that explained these points, and he did. It did happen. Nelson stated she did not use eye signs but followed breathing patterns as a measure of the depth of anesthesia. Well, you know, if you look at Goodell's signs, he also talked about changes in breathing, eye signs, that sort of thing. The defense then asked Goodell if there were any other physician anesthetist in the world who believed and wrote that what he was saying, and he said no.
Okay.
Nobody looks good under cross-examination, just so you know.
The other thing was the defense had been advised that Dr. Goodell had an anesthetic death, but he repeatedly denied that this ever had happened.
Interesting.
So it's getting hot, isn't it? That case
I
is.
mean
Wouldn't you
it.
like to be a fly on the wall
Now, did
back
they
in
ha-
1934
Yeah.
to hear those arguments?
Did they have stenographers and
I
actually?
bet they had the windows open and birds flying in.
Yeah.
I don't know how they
But now-
they had to keep records of some way,
Yeah,
but I don't know how.
But keep in mind, and most of this, what you see is there are surgeons who are testifying for Dagmar and surgeons that are testifying against Dagmar. So it looks to me as though all of their witnesses that they brought forward, with the exception, probably I don't know whether Dr. Goodell was a surgeon or not, but at that time they were operating and seeing patients and everything else. But it's just interesting that you don't see any other nurses that administer anesthesia being called to the witness stand.
Yeah.
Interesting. All right. Well, Sandy, we've got round 1 behind us. Let's talk about round 2. The
Okay,
defense.
now it comes to the defense. Although the defense argued the nurse anesthetist was very well trained to administer anesthesia, there was never an argument presented that the nurse anesthetist could do this alone. You'll see when it gets to the ruling, it's under the supervision and direction of a physician, any physician, okay? But that has been something that has been left hanging all these years. All right, many surgeons and defense physicians stated that they had little anesthesia training, and the nurses were very capable of administering anesthesia. And they, as physicians, were responsible for everything and everyone in the operating room. So
Everything.
everything. They're in
Everything.
charge. Some defense witnesses stated they were responsible for the total care of the patient, even if the anesthetist was a physician anesthetist. They were still in charge. It's my patient. I'm in charge. And in other words, they were just singing the captain of the ship doctrine, which was very popular at that time. Some surgeons stated they would rather have the physician as anesthetist so they would not have the responsibility for the anesthetic. But some surgeons testified they decided most of the time what kind of anesthetic they wanted, no matter who gave the anesthetic. And Florence Henderson, again, a renowned nurse anesthetist time, testified on the behalf of Nelson. Also, the defense of Nelson called director of the nurses training program at St. Vincent's Hospital to testify. She called attention to the fact that the California Board of Health established curriculum for all schools of nursing in the state. The plaintiff had argued the Nurse Practice Act did not say much about practice of a nurse and did not give nurses authority to administer anesthesia. The defense countered that the state did not have a law prohibiting nurses from administering anesthesia, but the state also mandated that content actually be taught requiring the nurse to know about anesthetic drugs. And some nurses, even those without advanced training in anesthesia, again, as Nancy said, administered ether to laboring patients, even when a physician was not present.
Well, let me stop you. Now, think about it. I don't even know if they're still in existence, but you taught us about Penthrane handheld vaporizers. And I know they were still in use whenever I was a student nurse because I was my cousin's coach when she had her first baby, and I was in nursing school, so that had to have been around 1982, 1983, somewhere. And she retained part of her placenta, and they used Penthrane.
Yeah.
They still had them. So that's a nurse or self-administration of anesthesia, right?
Yeah.
So that could have been part of the...
Yeah, the idea of those Penthrane inhalers, they would strap it to the patient's wrist or something, and they could breathe it, as they were uncomfortable. And then the idea was when they got a little sleepy, maybe their hand would fall away. But that was before you let the whole family come into the room, and then the family kept holding the mask on the...
Yeah, that's right.
let me help you out there a little bit.
That's like the PCA pumps. They push the button, they're out, and they keep pushing the button.
But anyway, some other arguments that were well received, I think. The defense argued there were hundreds of nurse anesthetists in California and around the country. Well, we know there was almost 150 of them in California at the time, very close to that number. And many nurse anesthetists were working at very reputable hospitals, the best of the best that we could be found in the United States. The Mayo Clinic, of course. Presby in New York, that's where Annie Penland was from, who served on the front line during World War I. Lakeside Hospital in Cleveland, Gertrude Fife and Agatha Hodgins, and Barnes Hospital in St. Louis, Helen Lamb. First anesthetic for pneumonectomy was Helen Lamb. And how can you argue that it's not a good, acceptable practice when the best hospitals in the country, this is their routine? And many of those nurse anesthetists had served well in World War I in France, and so they had all that record. And there was a recently formed National Association of Nurse Anesthetists that was formed in 1931. This trial was in 1934. So they had all that. The defense called witnesses and advanced evidence to show the giving of drugs, here you go again, under the direction or understood instruction of a physician was a recognized practice and within the limits of the definition of nursing. The recognition and reporting of changes in a patient's condition and acting accordingly under the direct or understood supervision of a physician was within the practice of nursing. Nursing education, as accepted by law, gave instruction in the administration of anesthetics and recognition of the signs and stages of anesthesia, and it was an established practice within the law for registered nurses to give anesthetics as a nursing duty. Now, before we I go into the end of the trial, and then Nancy will talk about the decision, but we can never underestimate how much influence Dr. Hunt had on this. He talked Dagmar Nelson into coming to California in a hotbed.
Yeah.
He knew it was going to happen. And at the same time, he was by her side the entire time. He was getting very strong physician anesthetists to testify for the defense. He financed this trial along with Sophie Winton and Hunt and Curtis and some of the others. So he was very influential in its outcome. So the trial lasted 12 days. And I looked, I said, I wonder how old this woman was then. I just looked it up last night. So alone, single woman, on the stand, off and on for 12 days. She was 42 years of age.
And not married.
Not married.
Did she ever marry?
No.
Of course not.
No. And
because no man could.
on July
man.
27th, 1934, both sides rested their case. Now, I think this last part is hilarious. The attorney for the plaintiff, Coslin, I think was his name, said in the closing arguments that he wished the record to show there was nothing personal intended in trial. And from all he heard, it sounded like Nelson was a very good anesthetist. Nothing personal against you, Dagmar Nelson. And the judge responded, we all know that. There is nothing personal intended. It's just a suit. That's what he said. And he shut him right down. So
Wow.
that was the end of the closing arguments. And then we come to the decision.
So, Nancy, I'm sure you're going to tell us all about the decision and the ramifications of that decision.
Well, Judge Campbell did release his decision on July 31st, 1934. And what his decision said is that at the same time mentioned in the complaint, Defendant Nelson was engaged as a nurse anesthetist under the direction and supervision of operating surgeons and with the knowledge of St. Vincent's Hospital. So you can see here is where we get into direction and supervision. That the act of Defendant Nelson, under the evidence introduced in this case, do not constitute practice in medicine or surgery under the Medical Practice Act. That evidence in this case is insufficient to make a case against defendants of practicing medicine without a license in violation of the Medical Practice Act. So, essentially, she won.
She won.
She won, but in a sense,
Yay, Dagmar.
we
Yeah, and I wonder if she was, clearly she couldn't work for those 12 days. I mean,
Right.
can you, Jeremy, maybe she did better with her money than CRNAs do today. I mean, they were about to lose their minds over the pandemic and not working
Yeah.
for a few weeks, but still.
Yeah.
Think
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah.
She didn't have anybody else to pay her bills.
Yeah. that's
Unless
true.
we find out Dr. Hunt was or something.
well,
Yeah,
listen, she babysat for his children.
Well, that don't mean anything. Ask Jude
Yeah.
Law about
He
that.
paid for her lawsuit.
Yeah, paid for her
Just saying.
lawsuit.
I mean, I want that story.
She's not worried about the money.
All right, go ahead.
Okay.
Sorry.
So it was a
Okay.
win. And then what happened, Nancy?
Well, on November 19th, 1934, Chalmers Francis filed a formal notice of appeal to the California
course he
Supreme
did.
Court. And in that, he described the practice he described the practice and education of nurse anesthetist. Okay, he did that in his.
And actually,
formal
before
notice.
that, he tried to declare a mistrial.
Yeah.
And so he lost that. And after he lost that, he went to the California Supreme Court.
Yes,
Yeah,
he
so
did.
from July
He
to
wasn't giving up.
November, he was not giving up.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
So at this appeal, what was the National Association of Nurse Anesthetists, which later became AANA, filed its first amicus curiae, which that means friend of the court brief, and it described the real practice and education of nurse anesthetist. It was the only amicus filed in the case, and the American Society of Anesthetists, which incorporated in 1935.
The American Society of Anesthetists, and then they became the American
Yeah.
Society of
Yeah.
Anesthesiologists.
They
Well,
became-
isn't that interesting?
Okay. Remain silent. Okay. So there was a an association of physician anesthetists, which became the American Society of Anesthesiology.
Okay,
They were silent. They did not.
Not to jump ship here, but there's an argument over who had a formal organization. AANA was 1931. And they were
Their
actually
charter
1935.
said 35, 36. It was around the time of the Dagmar Nelson case that they became a national organization. But they later argued that they were incorporated in 1905.
Because
and all that I can find is that was a New England, New York Association of Anesthetists, Physician Anesthetists. And at that time, they were having a lot of states that were organizing, but not as a national body.
So we incorporated 4 years before they did.
If the numbers are right, if they are right that they did incorporate in 1905, then of course they were well ahead of us. But from reading history and all that was going on and all the battles at the state and the state groups, I cannot believe they were organized as a national body in 1905. And our gun never believed that either. She said their charter said, I think 1936, 35, something like that.
Okay.
But they stayed silent in this whole case.
Well, they haven't shut up since.
I know. So on May 18th, 1936, the California Supreme Court released its ruling, and it affirmed the decision that was made by Judge Campbell. Never say die. Chalmers Francis attempted to raise money to take the case to the U.S. Supreme Court, but he failed, and the case finally was dropped.
Now you get it.
Wow.
So when he says, I got to have some money, open your pocketbook, open your wallet, and all the people that would have been supporting him verbally said, we can't do that.
Well, that part has changed.
And I think in some of my reading, I found that it would have cost like $1,500 in 1934 to get this to the Supreme Court, and they couldn't come up with that. And
but
how much is that in today's dollars?
$1,500.
$1,500.
1934. Gosh.
But remember that the Depression was close to the end, but there was still a lot of people with no money to pay the physicians, and so
that part I can say I think has changed, because now the docs will open their pocketbook.
Oh, they will. You're right about that.
Yeah,
that has changed.
And so anyway, the case was dropped. But as Sandy was saying earlier, the role of Vern Hunt that he played in all of this, you can't underestimate it. His assistance included unstinting expenditures of money in getting the best counsel and energy, rounding up witnesses, and in giving the lawyers a solid background of information on which to build their case. So he was very, very active in the background, helping her defense and also supplying money so that they had good lawyers and everything to help her out. So he was a good friend to her.
Yeah, sounds like it. So Sharon, that would be worth $33,727 in today's dollars.
Huh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, God.
Average
just
compound interest rate of 3.56% during that time play.
Well, just think, and they spent $250,000 on me, so they would have forked over $33,000 in a heartbeat.
Yeah, absolutely.
These days.
But one thing that just came to mind while I was, talking about all this is obviously, or I would think, looking at how the physician was really stepping out there and saying they were in control of everything in the room, then that makes them liable for everything in the room. But obviously there weren't like malpractice cases and things going on during this time. Otherwise, I don't think they would have been stepping out there claiming that they were in charge of everything.
Well, I think it goes back to the time, the gender issue, and I still think that's a piece of it that we just can't. It's integral in it.
Oh, it is. I'm not saying it isn't, but I just don't think they would have.
Right, I agree.
You know what I'm saying?
Wholeheartedly. Yeah.
Well, I think that's some of the trouble we run into now.
Right. Yeah, people
But
want to
it's just
shield
like-
that responsibility now.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like go back to before we started, when we started moving for removal of supervision. Part of what was going on was anesthesiologists were coming in and telling the obstetrician they were liable for the nurse anesthetist, and they wouldn't be liable for them. And of course, that changed a lot of rural hospitals. The
Sure.
anesthesiologist got the job, and the CRNA was out in the cold. So, like I say, I think had malpractice been a big issue then, I'm not sure that they would have stepped out and claimed responsibility for everything, is all I'm saying.
And with that, we conclude the first part of our captivating podcast series delving into the extraordinary life and groundbreaking achievements of Dagmar Nelson. From her humble beginnings to the pivotal trial that forever solidified nurse anesthesia as a respected profession. But our journey doesn't end here. Join us on the next episode as we continue to unravel the remarkable story of Dagmar Nelson in Part 2. In the upcoming episode, we'll venture beyond the trial, exploring the profound impact that winning the case had on Dagmar's life and the profession as a whole. Join us on the next episode of Beyond the Mask for that great story. Today's show is brought to you by the folks at CRNA Financial Planning, an independent consulting firm that offers financial planning services exclusively to CRNAs and their families. From planning for a child's future college expenses to building a predictable income stream in retirement, the firm is committed to offering you comprehensive financial services, customized to fit your unique needs and objectives. If you have questions about your financial future, get them answered. Call the team at 855-304-3748. That's 855-304-3748. Or go online to crnafinancialplanning.com.
Hi, this is Jackie Rolls, President of the International Federation of Nurse Anesthetists and President and founder of Our Hearts, Your Hands, a global anesthesia support community that takes donations to allow nurse anesthetists in low and middle income countries to go to educational programs, buy equipment, or textbooks. Your donations are tax deductible, and we would appreciate your support.
Be sure to subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and anywhere you like to listen to shows. Also be sure to check out BeyondTheMaskPodcast.com. Each episode is posted there with a corresponding blog post, and we timestamp important parts of the episode to help you quickly get to the content you're looking for. Also check out the special series section on the site. You can follow along and catch up on the CRNA History Series, episodes specifically about political conversations in the industry. Or try the CRNA Personal Finance Series. It's all on BeyondTheMaskPodcast.com. And if you have a question for the show or want to be a guest, or even suggest a particular topic, fill out the contact form on the site or send an email directly to us at info@BeyondTheMaskPodcast.com. And lastly, let's take the conversation social. Check out our Beyond the Mask podcast Facebook page and Facebook group.